Hello, my name is Ward Miller. I'm the Richard H. Driehaus Executive Director of Preservation Chicago, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Architect Charles Moore, the designer of California's famous Sea Ranch, was one of the chief proponents of postmodernism. His work brought a return to more ornamental detail, steep roofs and shingles, and other classical features. Today we'll learn more about Charles Moore from Kevin Keim, director of the Charles Moore Foundation. Next, you've heard for a year about the destruction of Craig Ellwood's Zimmerman house in Los Angeles. Now you'll hear attorney Evan Dyer's plans to bring it back. And no, he's not suing Chris Pratt. Finally, we'll talk with Lou Grotta on preserving a Richard Meier-designed house for the future. And now, here's your host, trying his best to preserve himself for the future, Mr. Modernism, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. In not that many years, I'll be graduating to Social Security, a milestone I never thought about as a kid or in college. In fact, the maximum age that ever crossed my mind was 40, and wow, that was a long time ago. Now I've entered the strange new world where my metabolism has decided to take a vacation and not tell me where that is. The problem is that somehow also Facebook knows this, and it's pounding me with ads.
Oh, no.
The most frequent is the chair exercise regimen, whereby doing 100 variations of push-ups on a chair, I'll be jacked and turn into J.K. Simmons. Then there are the buxom blondes in tank tops with huge lips offering weird juice cleanses that are only guaranteed to make me angry and hungry. I do go to the gym once a week, but that doesn't counter the other 6 days of mostly sitting around. Yet, you do what you can do, and I press on. Every Monday is a new beginning, and while it's too late to get in shape, whatever that means, it's never too late to move and eat well. I'm even considering becoming a vegetarian, part-time. The part where I get an In-N-Out burger once a month. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Palm Springs, Malibu, Los Angeles, and Toronto.
Architect and author Charles Moore is considered the father of postmodernism, as well as the design term called placemaking. After graduating from Michigan in 1947,
Go Wolverines!
And Princeton in 1957,
Go Tigers!
He was a teaching assistant to the great Louis Kahn, and he became lifelong friends with fellow postmodernist Robert Venturi. In 1959, Moore was teaching at Berkeley, and he teamed up with Donlin Linden, William Turnbull, and Richard Whitaker to form MLTW. This design firm created the heralded postmodern Sea Ranch development north of San Francisco. Moore's work brought more ornamental detail, steep roofs, shingles, and skylights, and made him one of the chief proponents of postmodernism, along with Venturi, Michael Graves, Stanley Tigerman, and Charles Jenks. Charles Moore died in 1993. Today's guest, Kevin Keim, is director of the Charles Moore Foundation in Austin, Texas. It was established to preserve Moore's home and studio and celebrate the importance of placemaking, one of Moore's founding principles. Keim graduated from Notre Dame.
Go Fighting Irish!
And then went to work for Moore. Together, they wrote books including An Architectural Life and Place Notes, a series of travel guides that create a sense of place. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Kevin, how did you and Charles Moore meet?
Well, it's a funny story. I was poised to graduate when suddenly the economy tanked. And
which time? There were a bunch of those.
Yeah, well, exactly. This was in the late 80s. And 9 months before we were to graduate, all of us had the accurate feeling that we were not going to get work. In fact, I remember there was something called Black Friday when SOM suddenly fired half their staff, gave them pink slips before the weekend. Chicago tended to be the place where most Notre Dame graduates went to get their teeth wet. So I actually applied for the very first summer institute that the Prince of Wales started.
Oh.
And I thought, well, since I'm not going to get a job, why not just go off to England and spend the summer watercoloring and looking at English gardens and houses? That would be fine. And he, in fact, accepted me. But then Thomas Gordon Smith became dean of my school when I was in Rome. And when I returned, we became good friends. He went off to Austin to lecture and had lunch with Charles because they knew each other way back from the Berkeley days. Thomas came back to South Bend and said, I had lunch with Charles and he mentioned that he's looking for somebody. He said, I want you to go into my office right now and call him. And I said, well, I just can't call him out of the blue. And he said, go into my office and call and talk to his secretary, Barbara. I did. We managed to somehow find a little keyhole in the schedule when I could fly down to Texas. And Charles gave me one of his famous so-called interviews that really amounted just to driving him over to campus one day and helping them to organize his slide lectures in my lab. And he hired me and said, when are you going to come to work? And I said, well, I should graduate first. He said, that's good. I'll see you later in May. And so that's how it was. And I was inexorably drawn into Charles Moore's world. And I had to write my regrets to the other Charles.
Ah, yes, right.
Indeed. Yeah.
And so how long were the two of you working together?
No, he died, I guess it was going on 3 or 4 years after we worked. And in fact, the very morning, I was loading Charles's gigantic Texas Suburban Chevrolet to drive. We were going to have a road trip that afternoon out to the Sea Ranch from Austin. He had purchased a site in the Redwoods, an acre, and everybody had kind of conspired to maneuver Charles into doing that because we felt that Sea Ranch was the one place he didn't like to leave. His health was precarious, and that would be a place where he could settle down and have his quasi-retirement, which would really mean having a studio, live in number 9, and have people come in, and he would be the kind of design hermit guru up there. But as I was loading the car between my apartment and the compound here, the phone rang, and one of my best friends, Samantha, with whom I worked, said, Kevin, Charles just died.
Wow,
and
wow.
It was the air was let out of the balloon all of a sudden. And that this happened on the day of one of his mythic moves, usually cross country and in about 10-year intervals, was both poetic and deeply sad. He was 68.
And how long after that was the foundation formed?
Well, it took a few years because, like most estates, it was mired in complexities and then also the usual lengths of time that lawyers need to sort things out. But in Charles's case, he was so far flung with partnerships in Connecticut and Los Angeles and his family in California and all kinds of components having to do with the archive of the buildings, all of the art. It took some time and teetered on the verge of collapse because of these complexities. But I sort of was in the middle of it just by virtue of knowing many of the people involved and was able to finally sort things out to the degree that we could begin the foundation and start taking care of Charles's buildings and debt, I might add. Since then, I've helped build it up into a foundation that cares for this, but also now takes care of the Burns House in Santa Monica Canyon. And we both own and help take care of the condominium number 9 at the Sea Ranch.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the Sea Ranch. That is a project for which he was very well known. How did that project get started?
Well, it got started because Charles left Princeton, and Donlin Linden and Bill Turnbull, both from the Bay region to begin with, came with him. And then Dick Whitaker followed soon thereafter. And they were all sort of moonlighting and getting started with teaching. And gradually, they got some little cabin projects down in the Santa Cruz Mountains that were tiny, For certainly, they were not more than 1,000 feet, or even smaller, 400 to 800, with even littler budgets. They were able to infuse those little projects with ideas that were percolating, based largely on the shared enthusiasms at Princeton and their time with Lou Kahn. Larry Halperin told me the story that one of the cabins, the Bonham cabin, was submitted for a design award at Sunset Magazine. And Larry was a juror. He arrived late to the presentation, and he said his fellow jurors had already rejected a number of projects, and they were leaning against the wall, mounted on foam core. And Larry was flipping through them and saw the Bonham cabin, and he said, well, wait a minute, why is this rejected already? I think it's remarkable. And they said, well, that's not architecture.
What?
Huh.
Exactly. Because they were still in the throes of the modernist, shall we say, rhetoric about what qualifies as, quote, important architecture or acceptable architecture.
Yeah.
And he said, well, I certainly think it's architecture. And he said, I think at least the redwood next to it should get an award.
That's good.
They didn't concur, but Larry kept it in mind. And when Al Boke, working for Castle and Cooke in Hawaii, began to draw together the project at the Sea Ranch, first by getting the land in Northern California in Sonoma County, Al Boke's first task was to think about who would be the first set of architects whose charge would be to develop the prototypes for building there, and in a more general sense, develop just what it would be as far as the direction of architecture and the philosophy behind it and the image of it, as you will. There would be two different sets. One set would do the prototype single-family houses, and one set would be the condominium. The condominium law was quite new, in fact, and so that proved to be more challenging because they had to think about just what people might be interested in this challenging landscape. So he selected Joe Eschrich for the single-family houses and then MLTW for the condominium. Larry would be the landscape architect.
And what year was all this happening?
That was probably beginning late 62, 63. Larry, given that they hired him first to begin to assess this gigantic piece of land, was helping Al select architects. And he said, I met this Charles Moore, and I remember a project that he did that was submitted to Sunset. And I think that it is very simpatico with what we're trying to do here. Let's talk to them. And so they did. And they hired MLTW. And I've often said that a great part of what MLTW was, apart from the work, was the very idea of the practice, which was so counter to how most architects were practicing in the United States, and indeed what people felt an architecture firm was, which is to say a very hierarchically organized entity with the grand poobahs in the glass office,
Right.
Enjoying cigars, while there were very carefully ordered lines of drafting tables outside and men in white shirts and skinny black ties with their slide rules drawing everything. MLTW was more like a band. These were four guys who were in a decrepit basement office, Charles said, often flooding with the fluorescent lights spookily sparking above, and four of them sitting around a table jamming. And that makes light in a certain sense of the seriousness of it. But the point is that they were all equals, and they were all trying to infuse their projects with everything that each person could bring to the table. There was an apocryphal myth, maybe, Donlan might be able to confirm it, that they often liked to design where they would be sitting at this round wooden table with drawings and books stashed about, but only one pencil. If your idea faltered, you had to pass the pencil to the next guy. So it became almost a game or an idea of play, children's play, which is actually very important for how Charles was beginning to think about designing back then.
Where were the offices for MLTW?
They moved around a little bit, but they ended up really in Hines Street in Berkeley, which is in the Berkeley Flats.
Okay.
And one of the things that I found fascinating in preparing to talk with you, Kevin, I've seen pictures of a sea ranch for a long time, and I thought it was maybe 10 or 12 little buildings, but the population out there is around 1,300. There's a lot of people.
Oh, yes. It's a vast piece of land. And what happened with that, Castle and Cooke was a Hawaiian corporation, and they owned a lot of pineapple plantations on the islands. And at a certain point, they realized that that type of real estate was just far too valuable to be growing pineapples on. And so they started developing little towns on parts of those land. And Al Boki was a vice president who did one of the villages on Hawaii that was very successful. And he said to his bosses, look, I really want to try this in California on the mainland. They said, okay, go and look, but we can't imagine that there would be any piece of land that would be suitable and available. He found a piece of land, I think, between San Diego and La Jolla, and was ready to buy it. But then he was in a saloon or a bar one night, and somebody said, hold off on that. I just heard about a ranch that's going for sale up in Sonoma County. And he said, we're not going all the way up there. It needs to be down here where there's sunshine. And he said, no, listen, I have a little plane. I'm going to pick you up tomorrow morning. Let me just fly you up there and let's look at it from the sky. And so they flew up and he saw this. He landed, called Castle and Cooke and said, I have found it. This is it. I think they got it even before it went on the market. And it was a rancher who held a piece of land that I think is about 9 miles long. It is the uppermost 9-mile stretch of coastline in Sonoma County before you cross the river into Mendocino County.
Okay.
And, well, it could be a mile wide. So it's probably 9 miles by about 1 mile. So they bought it. And it was a piece of land that had a history of first being logged when San Francisco was being built in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then once that was depleted, ranchers started using the land. They tried cattle once, but it turned out to be too wet for raising cattle. And they switched to sheep. And over time, the sheep and that kind of intensive ranching did a lot of damage to the land. The economics of that kind of real estate being used to raise sheep just didn't work anymore. And so that's why it changed to this.
If you want to learn more about Sea Ranch, you can go to their website, which is tsra.org. Kevin, when we were preparing for this, you told me that Charles Moore was one of the most misunderstood architects. How come?
Well, I think there developed at a certain point a kind of zeal among art historians and architectural historians, a proto-Victorian zeal, I call it, to maybe emulate Carl Linnaeus a little too much and try to organize everything into isms and insert people into discrete cubbyholes. I think the sense was to try to either understand the unrolling of history or at least the march of carousels in art history slide lecture rooms.
Making that sound that they always make, going ka-ching, 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 ka-ching.
Yes, yes. Cadence by all of the students snoring, providing the bass line.
Yep.
And I think that ended up creating strange bedfellows among architects that was based mostly on just the image of what historians would look at. That was compounded by the fact that architectural historians who are not trained as architects often fall short of understanding what they're looking at. Now, that is being very patronizing and dismissive of me, but my criticism stands.
Yeah, I think you're allowed to say that.
Yeah.
Yes, because I think that they relied too much on, again, this art historical approach of just looking at the flat image. That was then compounded by the sudden expansion of publishing that occurred in the 20th century with books and magazines and journals. And I think in particular, Charles's work simply cannot be understood on the flat page. No matter how stirring the photography, one cannot get a sense of his work in the flat image. Even aided by drawings, it's difficult because what Charles Moore was doing was so fundamentally knitting together plan and section that unless you have a full set of drawings with sections cut at practically every 18 inches and plans, it is even difficult to determine the nature of these buildings. And so you end up, as you mentioned in the introduction, suddenly Charles Moore is aligned with Michael Graves. And their work could not be any more different, in my view. I often say to students, if I were to give, say, a Michael Graves plan to a seasoned architect, you would basically be able to determine the form of the building with a little bit of knowledge of his tool chest. Not so for Charles. If you're presented with a plan, say, of the condo or of Orinda House, you simply can't determine it. And that speaks of how they were doing entirely different things with their architecture. That's a big part of the challenge here. And so as we march into 2025, which is incidentally the 100th anniversary of Charles's birth, I'm working on a book only about Orinda House, which came before the Sea Ranch, in an attempt to try to reframe how we look at Charles's work and how we understand it.
For the non-architect, is the best way to experience his work just to visit
Absolutely.
one of the buildings?
Absolutely. I have seen this again and again and again and again, particularly this past summer. I spent the past summer in Los Angeles, and I would take students and professors and members of the public, and they walk in, and to watch their reaction to the buildings is fascinating because they're arresting. They've never experienced spaces like it, where it's about first thwarting your expectations about what you're about to experience, because so often the envelopes, the containers or carapaces, if you will, of Charles's buildings are austere, they're small in scale, diminutive, and they don't give a lot away. But then once you're brought in, you're all of a sudden in a world that is completely different. And it's the ruse of every fairy tale, from Alice in Wonderland to Narnia. But Charles's brilliance was he was a master of scale and your perception of scale. We've all been to the standard McMansion where you're supposed to be impressed by everything you see from the street, even overwhelmed by the display of wealth or, in most cases, lack of taste. But then when you cross the threshold, you instantly feel diminished as a human being. You feel smaller. You feel as though you've been just kind of swallowed whole by a blue whale. And Charles understood the opposite is far more powerful. That you come into his buildings, particularly his houses, expecting to enter a tiny little domain, but then suddenly everything just opens up. And it somehow magnifies your presence as a human being, makes you feel bigger, your emotional response larger. The famous condo in Westwood is a tiny, tiny little space. Charles wrangled himself into a real estate deal that was supposed to be a duplex and said, I'm so good with small sites, I can get a triplex because I need a place to live. And Charles figured how he could turn the fire stair into his little house. When I recently had Maria Stella Casciato there, who's head of the archive at the Getty, and this condo has exactly 1/3 the number of steps as the Spanish steps in Rome. Steeper than Spanish steps, certainly. And she climbed all the way to the top. And when she got at the top, she looked down at me and she said, Kevin, only Corbu and Charles Moore designed in section like this. It is about this compression of the space. You're using layers to divert your attention away from the radical smallness of these places.
Yes. Well, this is really fascinating, Kevin. If people want to learn more about Charles Moore, they can go to the website, which is charlesmoore.org, of which you are the director. Are there going to be any exhibitions on Moore in 2025?
Not exhibitions, I don't think, because those take far longer. And I also have my idea about the effectiveness of exhibitions. The other thing that I would encourage is to read. Bob Venturi, in fact, once said to me over lunch, he said, we know how so many architects write as obscurely as possible in order to appear profound. Charles wrote so clearly and with such humor that it made his ideas accessible. It didn't diminish how scholarly and how well-founded it was in deep research. In fact, he was only the second person in the United States to ever get a PhD in architecture. So I would encourage people to read Charles's books and essays. They are brilliant and ring true to this day.
Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to learn about Charles Moore.
Well, thank you. I hope I can come back and we'll talk even more about it because there's much more to cover.
We were speaking with Kevin Keim. By day, Evan Dyer is a personal injury attorney and a graduate of the University of Alabama.
Roll Tide!
But at night, he's tirelessly working with wife Jessie to rebuild the Zimmerman house, designed by architect Craig Ellwood. Working with Erin Ellwood, Craig Ellwood's daughter, they are rebuilding the house by using some spectacular detective work. George spoke with Evan via Zoom.
Evan, you're an attorney, and most people tend to think of attorneys' offices as being very stately, with lots of walnut and law books in the background and a big, massive wooden desk. But your office is not like that. Tell me about your office.
I did my absolute best to rip off Don Draper from Mad Men.
Okay.
That was the vibe I was going for. So I got it filled up with a mixture of some vintage and new stuff, Eames chairs, some Finjul stuff. I don't know, anything a good modernist office needs.
And I noticed in the photo that you sent me that there's a little bar over to the side. That's great.
Yeah, well, borrowed from Don Draper, but necessary because of my clients.
Let's start at the beginning of your journey with this project. You had been looking for a vacation home for some time and not finding it, right?
My wife and I had really wanted a vacation home, or more like a sort of get out of the city type home up in the Hudson Valley in New York. And we've been searching for quite some time. I desperately wanted to get a mid-century modern house, but we just weren't getting anywhere. There was no inventory, or the things we found they just didn't fit the bill.
And how long had you been looking?
Oh, since sometime in 2023. I can't remember exactly when we started, but it's been a while. It was a good amount of time.
So how did you learn about the Zimmerman house being destroyed?
Various articles just popped up on my feed about it. The internet was pretty pissed off about the whole thing, so there was ample media coverage, and that's how I found out.
And most people just read the article, but you had a different reaction.
Oh, yeah. We were in this hunt for a house and just weren't getting anywhere. And I saw this article, and I've been a Craig Ellwood fanboy for a while, and the idea just popped into my head. I brought it up with my wife, Jessie, and to my absolute surprise and delight, she was like, yeah, I think that's awesome. Let's do this. Let's see if we can rebuild it.
So what was the next thing you did?
Well, actually, I think the next thing I did was send you an email asking if there were any blueprints or floor plans that still existed. And you gave me a lot of invaluable resources and people to connect with to see what was out there.
So who are some of the people that you then connected with?
Well, the very first person was the so-called Ellwood whisperer, Barton Janke, who did a bunch of Ellwood restorations. I think he did the Hunt House, Hale House, the Zach Henry House, which was actually mostly destroyed by a fire. So he's got the mind for not just renovations, but building. He was really great, really helpful, provided some ideas. Erin Ellwood, Craig's daughter, who's like the only person that can really tell you what would have been in her father's head. We got her on board. And most importantly, your masses that you reach. You put out a call and they responded with a ton of really helpful information. And also Keith York of Modern San Diego. He had some never before seen photographs of the Zimmerman that he was able to provide for us that were absolutely instrumental.
And you have an architect that is working on this. So how are they able to integrate all this information into a plan for Zimmerman 2.0?
Steve Coker, who's the project designer, and Charlotte Ensign, she's the architect. I've known Steve for years and years and years. And when this idea came to me, I reached out to him, was like, is this even possible? Because unfortunately, as we came to find out, the blueprints do not seem to exist anywhere. So we came to the conclusion, like, if we're going to do this, we're going to have to do a lot of research to be able to rebuild it. So I talked to Steve, and he was like, yeah, I think it's possible. So long as we have some good sources and good reference material, we can do this.
And so they started using the photographs as a guide. And I understand at some point you were able to find kind of a magic dimension that allowed you to figure out how big things were?
Yeah, in the U.S. Modernist Archive, we were able to find, it was almost sort of an advertisement that featured a photograph of the Zimmerman. And I believe this was in Progressive Architecture. We found a one-page blurb that showed a picture of the Zimmerman and listed what was in it, like the various products. And one of the things, it actually showed us the tile sizes that were used. So the architects could go back and actually find the dimension by counting these particular tiles.
Were these kitchen tiles or bathroom tiles, or what kind of tiles?
What were the tiles surrounding the fireplace in the living room, which is one of the most iconic parts of the house?
Sure.
And also tiles in the bathroom that they found the photo of in the archives. They were able to count those up to get height.
So this really is quite a magical adventure here of putting the pieces together.
Absolutely. And some of the other things that we were able to find, somebody was able to provide the original building permits from the city of Los Angeles that showed dimensions of the exterior of the house, which was, super helpful.
Oh, yeah, of course. You must be so excited, you and Jesse, about the prospect of this now.
It's all I think about. Day in, day out. It's living rent-free in my mind.
Evan, how has your wife Jessie been involved in the project?
Well, she's really the one who's been looking up all of the parcels of land we've seen. She's researched it, she's found them, and it's just been incredible doing it. And she was the one who found the place where we're hoping to build the Zimmerman.
Where is the house going to be located?
Finding land for this has been, to be frank, an absolute miserable process. We had a offer accepted on a property up in Marlboro, New York, which is, in the Hudson Valley. That ended up falling through after we found out there were federal wetland regulations that would prevent us from putting a septic tank in. But recently, we have found a property and had another offer accepted in Newburgh, New York, which is also sort of more south in the Hudson Valley as well. And all that is remaining is a percolation test to see if the soil properly absorbs. And we're pretty hopeful that we'll get Municipal Board of Health approval, and our closing date is mid-October. So hopefully that's like go time.
Oh, that's great. How soon afterwards can you actually start construction?
First thing is we do need a septic plan to submit to the municipality. Once we have that, then the builders can start clearing some of the land. It's 6 acres of just woods at this point.
That's going to be beautiful.
It is. The Zimmerman's back is almost entirely just a giant glass window. So we want something nice to look at.
What is the topography of the area? Are there hills or mountains or a lake or anything you can view?
It's just going to be hilly woods that we can actually see. It's going to be absolutely gorgeous to look out there, see the woods, especially when it comes to autumn and everything's changing. Being that it is this time of year, that's another thing that I can't stop thinking about is how wonderful it's going to be able to see that.
Oh, certainly in the fall. Now, a lot of people ask about, in doing recreations of houses, where you are on the spectrum of purity. So on one end, there's trying to recreate the Zimmerman house exactly brick for brick, like it was in the beginning. And at the other end of the spectrum, there's making something that is Zimmerman-like, but really a totally different house. So where are you on that spectrum in your plans for this?
The idea is kind of to strike a balance. So the exterior is going to be as exact as we can make it. The interior dimensions and layout are going to be exactly the same. The original house had absolutely beautiful wood build-ins in the bedrooms. We're going to do that. Really, the only difference is there was originally sort of a maid's quarters that we're going to instead turn into sort of a study or TV room, which will be nice. Beyond that, we're just maybe change some of the materials. And that's where Erin Ellwood's going to become instrumental. In our discussions with her, she let us know, well, this was one of Craig's earlier houses. And as his career progressed, he worked with different materials. And she's able to give us insight into what she believes her father would have done in 2024. So we're going to let her take a lead on that. So it may be a bit different, but quintessential Ellwood.
Another question that people have asked, and particularly since you're an attorney as well. So are there any IP issues with recreating a house, or can you just take something and make something else like it on your own without having to worry about that part of it?
That's a multifaceted issue. One of the big things when it comes to IP, and specifically in houses and floor plans, there are certain laws that kind of allow free use, I believe, for things built before the 1960s or 70s. And of course, I believe the original Zimmerman was constructed in 1949. So it, fortunately for us, falls in that area. But more importantly, we have the blessing of Erin, who would be the person who would have some IP rights.
And she's participating in the project, so that makes it even better.
Yeah, I mean, once we found out she does interior design, it was a no-brainer to get her involved.
Has she been out to the site yet? When do you expect to have her out for a visit?
Well, it's not going to be for a bit. Right now, we have the final blueprints for the house. The only thing is they may need to be slightly modified depending on the actual site. So once we have the builder involved and the site cleared, there'll be minute changes to make it compatible with that area. And once we have that, that's when we want Erin to really be involved and let us know the finishes and that sort of thing. You have to go in order. First, you got to get the blueprints, then you got to figure out where to put it so it can all get finalized. And then you want to have your designer come in on it. So that's when we're going to bring her in.
In bringing this 1949 house into 2025, has your architect discovered any building code issues that have to be modified?
Not so much code issues, but the one thing is that the original Zimmerman had a completely flat roof, which was fine for Southern California weather, but New York weather where there's snow and a decent amount of rain, the roof has to have a slight incline. But beyond that, no, there really aren't any building code issues.
And you have the advantage, too, that the materials that are available now are so superior to what existed in 1949, particularly in the windows and doors.
I mean, the original glass house up in New Canaan, that shows you can build houses like that at the time, but maybe it wasn't the best idea or the most comfortable or usable. This will be, though, with all the updated material.
Evan, we are so excited for you, and please keep me posted on the progress of the house and put me on the list for the grand opening because I really want to see it.
We absolutely will. And I'll tell you, there's one other person who should get an invite to this, and that's Danny from Modern for All, their store out in California. But they were able to source a absolutely beautiful credenza that up until now lived in case study 16, which is another Ellwood house. So having something from that is just absolutely the coolest.
That's going to be fantastic. Evan, thanks so much for talking with me.
I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for everything you've done towards helping this project out.
That was George with Evan Dyer. On a hill in Morris County, New Jersey, stands a stunning sundial-shaped modernist house designed by Richard Meier and home to over 300 pieces of ceramics, tapestries, and other handmade treasures. This incredible home, owned by Lou and Sandra Grotta, along with the remarkable artworks they've collected over 66 years of marriage, have been the focus of 2 books by Meier, The Grotta House and The Grotta Home, A Marriage of Architecture and Craft. George Smart spoke recently with Lou and his son, Tom.
Welcome to the show, Lou.
Thank you. By the way, we are certified now to be set up a foundation, so it will be kept in perpetuity.
Oh, wonderful. So let's start off with, how's Richard Meier as a basketball player?
Not great.
How did you two meet?
My family and his family knew each other from way back when. I went to Sunday school with him. I went to Camp Kennebec in Maine with him. We were members of the same country club and the same temple. But I never thought he'd amount to anything. Yeah. And he was a man of few words. And we used to play basketball behind his house with his cousin, who was a well-known architect.
Peter Eisenman.
And there was never a word said about architecture. It was, they were very good cynics, though, I can say that.
So you must have kept up with him over the years until the time you built your house.
Oh, yeah. We always followed him and was, very familiar with his work. But he was always about, he was a big glass man. He had a lot of glass and steel, and we were about wood and stone. So while I admired his work, I never thought we'd ever hire him.
And when did you start collecting the American craft work?
I would say shortly after we were married. Sandy was a shop, never stopper, and she became a decorator. So we were constantly on the lookout. And we had an amazing simpatico as to what we liked. Our house originally was more traditional, and we happened to go to a woodworking show at the American Craft Museum, and that's where we saw the work of Joyce and Edgar Anderson, and that was the beginning of getting rid of what we had and evolving. It's been our life, okay? And the nice thing of the contents of our house, I would say, to this day, that 60% of it probably or more was done by people we got to know, some very well.
At what point did you and your wife realize you needed to have a bigger house to hold all this stuff?
Well, we always dreamed of having a good architect's house. Sandy did a lot of work for, other clients, but never had the opportunity to really work with a really good architect. So we wanted the architecture, and we had the collection and the idea, and it was marrying the two.
So how come you called up Richard Meier when you were a wood and stone man?
Because I knew him. I grew up with him. He was Dickie Meier to me then.
Okay,
and
all right.
I went over to see him. I remember going to him, and Sandy said, suppose he wants to be our architect. And I said, no chance. I'd read an article that was written by Barbara Diamondstein in which he said he didn't think he would do anything unless he had total control of the interiors. So I said, that's not going to be the case. So when we went to see him, I was going to him as a mentor as to who he would suggest. And I remember when he said, I've got the perfect architect for you. And I said, who's that? And he said, me. And I said to him, Meier, you're a real whore. But he said, I think my white background, your stuff will show up much better against my white backgrounds than it would if you do a wood and stone house.
Yeah.
I've done exhibition. I just hope that if we did come together, there'd be nothing that was must for you and a must for we'd have a head-on collision. And we never did. But, when you grow up with somebody in the neighborhood, he's still, stinky from the neighborhood. I'm not in awe of Richard Meier. And, the other thing I was concerned with is most of those names, or whatever you want to call them, we were small potatoes to them, our house.
Yeah.
We'd probably get their 13th assistant architect on the job. We might be small potatoes to them, but to us, this was the most important project since the Stone Age.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Now, how many pieces of art have you amassed to date?
I would say there's closer to 700, and by 200 people. And by the way, I sort of think art is the most abused word in the dictionary. It's a good design, and there's a few people, to me, the big compliment is if somebody's a magician. There's an art to cooking. There's an art to playing basketball. There are a few people who, when you see it, you say, how the hell did they ever do that? That's magic. Really, it was sort of, as Sandy would say, what I'm doing is orchestrating and trying to and make sure that hopefully that there's no sour notes. And our stuff is carried at speed over distance, the distance of many, many years.
Having lived in this house for a long time, were there any special considerations that you had to talk about with Richard Meier in designing the house, in the way it was put together?
Basically, just obviously certain storage things, how it flowed from room to room. Basically, this house, the way it goes from room to room, the transitions, is pretty much the way the old house was. And of course, this is, all open spaces. But Sandy, having had experience as a decorator, you can wind up over-suggesting, or things are so that what you do is you constipate the architect. And
I love that phrase, Lou, constipating the architect.
And curb their enthusiasm, right?
Wow.
So, basically, we try to give them as, free a hand but within the spaces that we need. But one of the things that was a big thing with us was, I always said the only thing that goes on a pedestal in our house is Sandy. And the thing was to be able to platform our work. Mm-hmm. If possible, be able to see it as close to 360 degrees as you could. If you look at the steps in our house that go down from the living room or go up from the living room to the dining room, the steps are really platform steps. There's probably 30, 40 pieces there sitting on the steps, and it was designed that way. And where I'm talking to you from, which is her desk, is a two-sided built-in that is home for her desk and her computer and all that. But also there's a bunch of Bob Stocksdale pieces. There's a bunch of things here.
I can see Lou through this Zoom call, and behind him is an example of what he was talking about, where there is a big flat surface, and there are about 15 pieces on it, and you can see them 360, which really does enhance the experience of viewing these pieces.
That you're looking at is her desk. And our bed is the same way. It's built into the wall, so it combines the architecture and the functionality. By the way, what my career did, we sold across the country, one customer in each city. So I always had time to go visit the customer, take them out to dinner or lunch. And then I was free to go to the local museums. And every good museum had a good craft store. So between visiting the local craft people and my field trips on business, I hoped I would get some business orders, but also Sandy, who came along with me, get some purchases for the house. One of the great advantages traveling around the world, Richard works a lot of places, so he would introduce us. Like when we were in Vienna, we had dinner with Hans Hollein, and his daughter showed us around Vienna for 3 days. So, and then...
That's nice.
And then, are you familiar with the magazine Global Architecture?
Oh, yes, very much so.
Futagawa, who, he was the editor, publisher. So he came to the house. And then when we went to Japan, he told us where to go and what we could miss. And this is our life. And as Sandy said, the goal is wherever you look, whenever you look. And it also made a bird watcher out of us. When you have this much glass, you look out more than you look in.
I bet. Yes. Yes, indeed. Now, the house is about 40 years old?
The house is, you got it. From the time we hired Richard, it was 5 years between design and 3 years in construction and 2 contractors. The first, it's built on a 32-inch grid, and there really are no moldings. And the first contractor just said life is too short. Generally, when you have moldings can cover a multitude of construction sins. And that's one of the things you come to respect. It's one thing an architect draw up, got to have the guys who can build it, and also who will tell them this isn't going to work.
Right. Tell me about your plans for moving the house ahead for the next generations as a house museum.
Basically, what we've done is we've set up a foundation. And when I go to hell, this will be, someone will live here. It'll be open, as it's been for 35 years, on an invitation basis. we're not allowed by the town when we got the variance to do this, to have more than a 6-pack or 8 people to come through at any one time. But we certainly encourage people to come. And otherwise, what would have happened here is we happen to be very lucky on the land we steal around us. There's one guy's got 20 acres on one side and 40 on the other, and they're open. Because of that, they told us at the town the chances was over 50% that if we sold this house, it would be knocked down.
Yes.
That's the crime that's happened with so many of these places.
Is there any kind of formal preservation easement on the house?
No, it's just I have certain restrictions, as I say, on how many people can come at any one time. But one other thing that I'm very lucky about, my son is a photographer and graphic designer, and my grandson does websites. So if you go on my website, grottahouse.com, you'll see this place is very well documented. And realistically, many more people will be able to see it on the website than ever would be able to get here. There's nothing like seeing it in person. Remember the architect Hugh Newell Jacobson?
Oh, yes.
When he came here, he opened the door and he said, "Son of a bitch." And he said, "You know what good architecture is? You open the door and you say, 'Son of a bitch.'"
I love that. Lou, thanks so much for talking with me. It's really been a pleasure. And you can see more about Lou and the house at grottahouse.com, right?
Right.
Thanks, Lou.
Thanks, and it was great talking to you.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Palm Springs, Los Angeles, Toronto, and Malibu.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 23,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Friendly is her middle name, or it could be Fiona. Jury's still out. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another Back to the Gym edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.